When we're called to things, they don't all just necessarily fall into place. They don't all necessarily just go exactly the way we thought, the way we planned. But it's important to recognize calling. And, I don't know if you've ever heard somebody say, just like Jacqueline said, I'm called to this. I feel like this is my purpose. This is what I'm supposed to do in life. Well, I believe that God has purpose and plan for all of us. That God calls all of us. And so this morning I want to talk a bit about calling and responding to that calling and how important that is through the life of Abram. So in Genesis chapter 12, that's where we're going to be, just in the first verses right there. And I want us to consider calling and responding to that call. It's an interesting, if you read in your Bible and you see Abram here as we're going to go along, that's Abraham, okay? Because God changes his name in fulfillment of God's promise and calling on his life in moving forward. Just like Jacob became Israel, there are certain people in the Bible whose names changed. The Apostle Paul was originally, his name was Saul. There's sometimes these momentous shifts that happen that's part of people's calling that happens in their lives too. But this morning, I want to talk about being called into the unknown a bit too. So I don't know if any of you felt called into a pandemic, but here we are. And sometimes calling happens through circumstance. We don't necessarily recognize the calling that we have until we get there. And it's how are we responding to what we've been called into? I believe that God is not a distant God. He's a present God. He doesn't orchestrate the negatives in our lives necessarily. He doesn't, he's not some heavenly tyrant. But at the same time, because we live in this world with people with free will and we do things and we have the results of our sins that infect not just, physically sometimes in our lives, but emotionally, spiritually, those can have impacts too. And recognizing calling is important. As I said at the beginning, I was reading this book about being called into the unknown, really, and it was about Lewis and Clark's travel across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, and how they journeyed and started out with canoes and hit the Rocky Mountains, which were real mountains, not the stuff they had in the East, and all of a sudden they needed to change canoes for saddles because you can't canoe over mountains. And they were off the map, off the grid, and we will see that with Abram here as well. So let's just take a few minutes to look at his life. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, it starts out, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country.'" A calling is a prompt to change. It's a movement. It's a shift. A calling should not just prompt us, but should motivate us. It's a recognition that I'm here not just for myself. There's a recognition that something outside myself is calling me, right? So if I call my children when they were out playing, it was somebody outside of themselves initiating change. It's like, okay, you've played long enough. It's time to go to bed. Get back in the house. And so call and change are part of what happens in our lives, and we can be prompted in so many different ways. Sometimes we're prompted by circumstances. We didn't quite feel to be called to try and do church online and in person, but hey, we were called to it because here was the moment, and that was the prompting, and we needed to respond. Right? A call demands a response. If I call to my kids and I get no response, I'm not happy with the situation. Are you? If you call out to somebody and they don't acknowledge you and respond to you, how does that make you feel? And if God is calling out to us, Are we responding to him? Now, it's interesting that we read this verse, but actually it starts a little earlier in their lives. In Genesis chapter 15, God says to Abraham, Abram still, I called you out of Ur. So when Abraham is in this place at chapter 12, verse 1, he's in Haran, and we're going to get to seeing that a little bit. But let's back up just a couple verses to 11, verse 31, and we'll see that there was procrastination going on. So I don't know about you, sometimes you feel called to things, like right now I'm feeling called to complete some school assignments for my seminary, and I've procrastinated a little bit on that, and I've had to press. Like, procrastination is where you feel like this is going to be difficult, or you feel like this is not going to be all joyous, right? Someone calls you up and says, hey, let's go to our favorite restaurant, you may not procrastinate. But when something difficult comes your way, you may not want to just jump in there. And we see that in their lives. In 11:31 here it says, Terah, who was Abram's dad, so he took Abram, his son, Lot, the son of Haran, his brother, so his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, the son of his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur to the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So if you don't know, like have a map of ancient Middle East, this would be like, okay, they were on their way and they just stopped off in the middle. No, going to Haran is like you live in Regina, Saskatchewan, and you have to go to Calgary, Alberta, and so you drive to Edmonton. Right? Haran is northwest of Ur. From Ur to Canaan is straight west. And so, instead of going straight there, they go from Regina to Edmonton to get to Calgary. It is way out of the way. Now, it says here that Haran was related to Terah. So there was a town named Haran. Whether that's a common name, whether it was relations, we don't really quite know here. But hey, you go and you hang around with your family, you hit up with the relations, and you go, let's just hang around here a while. Because it says, and they settled there. It wasn't they stopped over. It wasn't they hung around for a week. They bought a house, said, it's not bad here. Eventually we'll get where we're going. And that happens, I think, in all of our lives to a certain degree. We feel this call to something, but we recognize that there's a difficulty. There's going to take some effort. There could be even some sacrifice, some loss involved, and we're not quite ready to do that. And so, let's put it off. I'm on my way. We're sort of getting there. Yeah, we left Ur. We left the place where we were at, but we're just going to, stop off along the way. Even the disciples faced this. They were following Jesus, had this great experience with Jesus on top of a mountain. And they're like, Jesus, let's set up camp, stay here. We'll sell tickets. This will be awesome. Let's just do ministry from here now. And Jesus is like, no, we got to keep moving. And in our lives, where do you stall? Where do you stop? Where do you procrastinate? If there's this prompting, are you following through with it? Because that's an important part of calling in our lives. Next, we have the fact that they have to leave. Now the Lord said, 12:1 again, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. There are things they had to leave behind. Being called forward means what you have is going to stay behind you. Often we have difficulties not just with procrastination, but with letting go. That there are elements of our lives that we have to let go of. When Lewis and Clark hit the Rocky Mountains, they could have just stamped their feet and said, look, we're canoeists. We know rivers, we know rapids, we know how to portage, we know how to deal with water and a boat and a paddle. This is our deal. And just stopped right there. But they had to leave that behind for the unknown, leave that behind for things they weren't really skilled at. And they had to draw on other people, so they had to connect with Sacagawea and find a way through the Rocky Mountains. And oftentimes we can hit these bumps along the way, and we just like, I really want to go back to. And for all of us, we've hit this pandemic, and we all want to go back to, but the way forward is not back. There is no Back to the Future. Great movie. I love it. I grew up in the 80s. One of the big things, of my growing up years. But at the same time, there is no going back to get forward when it comes to those things. So as long as we stay attached, then we don't get to really move forward. And we see that happen with Abram here as well. Because if you get to verse 4, so Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he was supposed to leave his family behind. Remember, it's his family that got him in trouble. It's family that started his procrastination journey. So he gets there, he's hanging out with family. His father is the one who sort of arranged all this and got him there. And then now he's going to hang on to Lot. And you will see later on in his life, if you continue to read in Genesis, that Lot ended up being a problem for Abram. They have a fight over where they're going to settle and land, and so Lot chooses the best land. Then Lot gets mixed up with a shady city that he's in, with Sodom and Gomorrah, and it all just comes down to a big disaster. And then Lot has a problem with having a family where he shouldn't, with his family. And we end up with all this craziness going on because he drug Lot along. We see that in Moses' life. If you read about Moses, God called Moses. Moses was supposed to step forward and do this thing on his own. And he's like, I don't want to do it on, this is not my call to leadership. Maybe Aaron would be better. He's a better speaker than I am. And so God lets him bring Aaron along, but Aaron ends up causing trouble for him too. There are times where we have to recognize there are things we have to leave behind. We have to let go of in order to move forward. Now, that doesn't mean we completely forget the past, our families. That doesn't mean that we completely disassociate from those things, because all that past has brought you to where you are. The good, the bad, the ugly, your past has brought you to exactly where you are right now today, and from which you can build upon. Some people have had terrible pasts of abuse and those kinds of things, and that's terrible. But at the same time, is that past going to rule your life, or are you going to be strengthened in overcoming your past and moving forward from it? And so we can't be half-hearted in those things. We can't be lackluster. We have to leave and we have to move forward. We can't leave ourselves attached, or eventually you're going to hit the edge of that bungee and it's going to snap you back. And it's going to be a hard snap if you haven't moved forward from it. Back to verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. So it's not only a calling, it's not only a leaving, it's a moving towards. That there's something you're moving towards. Sometimes in our lives, the leave part's not hard. It's like, I want to leave this. This is, and we're busy leaving, but we're not going anywhere. You're moving from, but you're not moving to. And so you just go everywhere. Everywhere that's not there is where you're going, and you're not really going anywhere. But a calling is a calling to something. When I call my children to come home, it's to home to eat or to go to bed or whatever. When somebody calls you and says, hey, let's go have a meal together. Usually you sort out where you're going to have that meal together, right? You don't go, yeah, that'd be great, let's go eat. And you get up and you leave home because home is not where it is. but you never meet because you never agreed on where you were going. That's what it's like to leave without going towards something. In our lives, there is a towards, there's a place, there's a promise that God is taking us to in our lives. It may not be exactly where we planned. In fact, God just says, I'll show you when you get there. That's not exactly the to you sort of have in mind, but there was a promise that goes on, if you read the next verse, of what God was going to do in his life in blessing him. And in our lives, sometimes the to isn't necessarily as descriptive as we like, but it's towards something that we're moving. We're moving towards something, in a direction, towards a place, towards a situation that God is calling us to in our lives. And as you do that, you journey with God. God doesn't just leave Abram on his own. There are points where God connects with him all along the way in taking him to where he's supposed to go. And it's the same thing in our lives. I don't know if you've ever driven on a long journey and you're going somewhere, but on the road there's very few signs telling you like how far it is to this place. I know when we moved to Alberta, we drove along the northern part of Saskatchewan from Manitoba. And so we left from the Paw region and came across towards Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and through that way. And as you go along, there aren't many signs, and there's just road and trees. And there's a lot of miles or kilometers until you hit the next sign. Oh yeah, by the way, you still have this far to go. And it can seem like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? But you just got to keep moving forward towards, and not giving up. And that's why we see that you need a team. Verse 5, and Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and set out to go to the land of Canaan. Now, the other counterpoints that I had were negatives, right? There's procrastination, there's lackluster. But when it comes to team, it's actually make or break. It's either or. Your team can propel you to move forward, to get there, or your team can be the ones to drag you down. It's really either or, and you need a team around you that's going to keep you on mission, to keep you going to. The people around you have to be people that'll say, why are you doing that? How's that moving you towards your goal? You need people that are going to be honest with you and love you and care for you, but encourage you and challenge you. That's what church is supposed to be like. Right? We're supposed to be a team that supports one another and moves us in our mission in life. Team is also supposed to be the ones that help you through loyalty. You want to know that the people are going to stick with you through the tough times. They're going to be with you no matter what. That when it gets difficult, they're going to come and be there as a support and as strength for you. And when it's great, they're there also to celebrate with you. That's the part of adventure. As you adventure, you're going to hit difficulties. You're going to hit those challenges. And you need people around you that are loyal and that you can trust, that can support you and move you forward through it all. But at the same time, you want people there to celebrate with you. When you get to the top of the mountain, if you're standing there all by yourself, that's great, but so what? Who's there to celebrate with you? And that's the joy of team as well. So it's not only the strength and the struggle, but it's the celebration at the summit that we get with our teams. And so who's traveling with you? Who's journeying with you? And then there's a belief. You need a faith that there is a place you're going towards. Because sometimes there's a long distance between markers. We read the scriptures in here and see how God talked with Abraham. But we don't know that it was like daily that Abraham sensed God's voice. It seems more like, in the reading of it, that Abraham had moments along the way where he was checked in with by God. And that he had to sort of suss it out with his team and move forward with his team because they knew what they were doing in faith. They were moving forward, loyal to one another, on mission, trusting that God was with them in those moments where maybe God was silent. And we all face those times where it feels like, where's God in all this? But do we have a faith that trusts that God is there like he promises for us? Jesus said he would never leave us or forsake us, that he's always with us. And there are times where, man, in my day it feels like Jesus is really walking with me, that God is with me. I've got that sense of his presence and I can hear his voice. And there are days where it's like I feel like I'm on my own, I'm struggling out here. And that's why we need people. Adam wasn't good by himself. He needed Eve, right? Jesus needed his disciples. There's people that he needed around him. That's why when Jesus was having his tough time and he was in the garden praying, that Jesus comes back and he goes, can't you guys just stand with me in prayer for an hour? Can't you walk it out with me? And that was not just preparation for walking through a difficult time with Jesus' death and resurrection, but to move forward after Jesus ascended into heaven and keep walking it out. So, some takeaways this week. Jesus also said that his heavenly Father calls to people to come into relationship with him. Are you going to respond? Here this morning and you don't have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, through this man who died, but also rose so that he can live with us and in us and walk with us, journey with us. Today's a day to respond to the calling of God. And as a church, as church people, if you're Christians, are you responding to the mission and calling of God? God gave us a mission, a calling. And I'll talk more about that next week. Are you procrastinating or partial in your response to the calling of God in your life? Write it down. Write that calling down. I don't know, a lot of people put stuff on their fridges or the mirror in their bathroom. Where are you getting called to? Write that down and remind yourself constantly and have people you trust around you, a team around you, to help you walk that out together. Decide to go forward. Make a decision today. And lastly, who's journeying with you? Like I said, adventures are fraught with danger, but full of thrills. Share both in your life. We're not made to be alone in this world. Some of you, you've come here in person, but are you alone? You can be with people and still be alone. I don't know how many events I've gone to sometimes where I feel like I'm all alone in a crowd. That can happen. And some of you who maybe watch and are participating online can feel alone and not really part of. Really connect. Even if you have to distance and isolate yourself to some degree because of either having to quarantine or because you're trying to be careful because of your own health and health issues. Don't be alone. That is not how God created us. That's not how we're supposed to walk this out. We are supposed to be part of a team, of a family, of a group that walks with us. That's what church is supposed to be.